Hi guys, JazzieNerd here, and welcome back to another Sunday Snippet. And yes, I know I forgot last week. I kind of have an excuse. I'm working more hours finally. The only day this entire week, or in the entire last 7 days that I haven't been working is today. So I've been a busy girl for a week. Made more busy by the fact that Mom is still loading me down with lists of chores, even though I have a job now. 2 jobs, actually. So I'm going to start this Sunday Snippet off with a little bit of a story. So a couple weeks ago, I think it was last week, I was sitting in church on Sunday. I know, right? Church on Sunday. Anyway, I was sitting in church on Sunday right behind the pastor, because I actually always make a point of sitting right behind the pastor. He always sits in the very front row, just slightly right of center, and I always make a point of sitting right behind him. So when service is over, I can immediately get up, say, hey, that was a great sermon, and then maybe leave or hang around and talk with him. I'm actually very close to the pastor of the new church I'm going to. Anyway, when he got up to give the sermon, I noticed he left a book on his chair, conveniently upside down, so I could peek over the edge and read the information on the back. And it was a book about answering the big questions in Christianity, geared towards teens and youth groups. These were questions that dealt with things like homosexuality, the subject of, not last week's snippet, the week before that snippet, the last Sunday snippet, evolution, which is likely going to be the subject of the next Sunday snippet, which may not be next week, and biblical attitudes towards women, which is the subject of today's. And this is actually a topic I've been meaning to discuss for a very, very, very long time. This was actually on the mental list of topics I made up before I ever started this series. And it took me this long to get around to it. Anyway, this is kind of a major question people ask. I talked to someone once whose main issue with Christianity was the ideas about women in the Bible. And the ideas that kind of fueled our entire society's ideas about women. And those ideas came from this book, unfortunately. And actually, most of the points this person made were not correct. But they did make a few good points. And mainly, that point was that the Old Testament was not very kind to the fairer sex. We kind of got the bulk of the blame for original sin, thanks to Eve eating the dang apple, or whatever kind of fruit it actually was. Although, let me just say, I have read Paradise Lost, and the argument that snake makes would be enough to convince just about everyone, honestly. It is very, very, very convincing. Even in Elizabethan English. Anyway, I remember hearing the pastor of the church I used to go to talking about how the religious leaders of Old Testament Israel, the priests and the Pharisees, would go out of their way not to look at a woman if they passed her on the streets, to the point that they would actually walk into walls. I don't know if it was a joke or what, but he was talking about how they were sometimes laughingly called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees for that exact reason. Because they would walk into walls trying to not look at women. So the ideas about women in the New Testament are a little less clear-cut. It depends on whose epistles you're reading, basically. For 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, Paul says that women cannot and should not be leaders in the church. But the wording of this, the wording of the entire book of Timothy, he uses I a lot when he's laying down these guidelines. And that makes it very, very, very clear that these are Paul's rules, not God's rules. To make things more interesting is that Paul kind of, sort of contradicts himself. Because in Romans chapter 16, the last chapter of his longest letter, he greets and recognizes several women who could arguably be considered leaders in the church. Go figure. On the other hand, Peter was a bit less contradictory, ambivalent, ambiguous, whatever you want to call it. In 1 Peter 3:7, I actually didn't even know this verse existed until earlier today when I was looking through the index in the back of my Bible. He writes that husband and wife are equal partners in God's gift of new life, quote unquote. So, maybe not equal in all respects, but the obvious conclusion to be drawn here is that in the eyes of God, man and woman are now equals. Maybe they weren't always, but, in the post-resurrection, they have now become so. But you know what? Forget the epistles. Forget the epistles for a second. The final conclusion on something like this has to be drawn by looking at Christ himself. And it is very, 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 very clear in the Gospels that Jesus did not discriminate under any circumstances whatsoever. You got a little pissed off at the Pharisees and merchants a couple of times, but he didn't really discriminate. I mean, the guy had dinner with tax collectors, and he had Matthew was a tax collector. I mean, he associated with people like Mary Magdalene, who I talked about in an earlier Sunday snippet. She was not exactly an upstanding woman. And then there's the story of the Samaritan woman. Jews at this time hated Samaritans because they were half Jew and half something else. I don't actually remember what the something else is. Let's just say half not Jew. And that made them unclean. And basically, in the Old Testament, staying on God's good side was all about staying clean by following his laws. So if you wanted to stay on God's good side, you do not under any circumstance associate with unclean things like, non-Jews. So this woman had 2 strikes against her, one for being Samaritan, one for being woman. That's 2 reasons why the average religious leader of the day wouldn't even bother looking at her. And on top of that, she was kind of sleeping with a man who wasn't her husband. So that's a 3rd strike. She should have been out. Yet, not only did Jesus take the time to talk to her, he used her as a means of reaching the rest of the town with his teachings. If he would bother to choose somebody like that, I think that makes it pretty dang clear that he just didn't really care what race you were, or gender you were, or whatever. He came for everybody. He came for everybody. And despite all of that hubbub, I guess you would call it, about how the New Testament supersedes the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament laws and teachings are no longer particularly valid, it was the Old Testament ideas about women that persisted for some reason and affected our entire society's ideas about, women. I suppose all I can say is thank God for the feminist movement. Because if that hadn't happened, I don't think I would be making this video. I don't think I would have a YouTube channel. I would probably be married by now. I'm 20 after all, and I would probably be relegated to a kitchen somewhere. So, thank God for the feminist movement. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video in any capacity, head over to my YouTube channel, the JazzieNerd, and check out some other videos. If you enjoyed those, hit the subscribe button down there, because it's a big help. I will see you guys back here, hopefully next Sunday, hopefully before that. hopefully before that. I have a couple of videos I've been meaning to put up that, or well, more accurately, meaning to make. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. Anyway, until then, stay jazzy.